You crank every setting to ultra, hit play, and your beautiful game turns into a slideshow. Stick around, because by the end, I'll hand you the exact cheat sheet of what to turn on and what to turn off. Ray tracing, the light one. Let's start with the famous one. In most games, light is faked. Artists basically paint the shine and shadows on by hand, and it looks fine until you look closely. Ray tracing does something different. It actually traces how light travels, bouncing off a source, hitting a surface, and creating real reflections and shadows. Here's the difference. Without ray tracing, look at a puddle under a bright sign, and it's just gray mush. The reflection barely exists, and shadows fall on the wrong side. Turn ray tracing on, and that puddle mirrors the sign perfectly. The shadow lands exactly where the light says it should. But that realism has a price. Ray tracing hammers your graphics card, your GPU, the part that draws everything you see. It fills up the card's memory, and it tanks your FPS. And FPS just means frames per second, basically how smooth the game feels. High FPS is silky. Low FPS is that stuttery slideshow from a second ago. And ray tracing isn't always worth it. In a scene full of glass, water, and neon, it's stunning. But out in an open grassy field with nothing to reflect, you'll barely notice, and you just paid a fortune in frames for it. So if ray tracing is that heavy, is there anything even more real? Path tracing, the overachiever. There is, and it's ray tracing's overachieving big brother, path tracing. Ray tracing only handles light in certain spots. Look next to a huge neon sign, and you'll see areas it just skips. Path tracing calculates the light for the entire scene at once. The result gets so real, it's genuinely hard to tell the game from a photo. Of course, doing the whole scene means it's even heavier than ray tracing, and your FPS drops off a cliff. And funny enough, it's not always prettier. In a busy scene, path tracing can make reflections look too strong and glossy, while plain ray tracing looks more natural. That's why most people, including me, still reach for ray tracing unless they own an absolute monster of a graphics card. Those two are your heaviest FPS eaters. So what about the beauty settings that are basically free? HDR, the color one. First up, HDR, which stands for High Dynamic Range. Think of a faded old photo versus one where the darks are truly deep and the colors pop. That's what HDR does. It widens the contrast and the range of color, and it does more than look pretty. When the shadows and highlights separate cleanly, you can suddenly spot an enemy lurking in a dark corner or through fog. The best part? HDR costs you almost nothing in FPS. The catch is, your monitor or TV has to actually support HDR. Turn it on with a screen that doesn't, and you get nothing. So if your display supports it, absolutely switch it on. HDR handles color. But who cleans up those ugly jagged edges? Anti-aliasing, the edge smoother. That's anti-aliasing. Because games are built out of tiny square pixels, slanted lines come out looking like a staircase. That jagged look is called aliasing. Sit far from your screen and you might not notice. But most of us sit close, and those edges get harsh and distracting. Anti-aliasing smooths them into clean lines. It does cost some FPS, depending on the type. Some are heavy, some are light. My take, turn it on, but you don't need the very highest setting to get a clean picture. Near edges are smooth now. But what about stuff far off in the distance going blurry? Anisotropic filtering, the free win. That's where anisotropic filtering comes in. Picture a racing game. The road right under you looks sharp, but further ahead it smears into a blurry mess. Anisotropic filtering keeps those far, stretched out textures crisp all the way into the distance. And here's the beautiful part. On any modern card, it costs basically 0 FPS. This one's a free gift, so just crank it to X16, that's the max, and forget about it. Speaking of textures, how is texture quality different from plain old resolution? Texture quality, the detail one. Good question, because people mix these up. Texture quality is the detail on a surface, the cracks in a wall, the weave of a character's shirt. Resolution changes the pixels of the whole image, like 1080p versus 4K. Texture quality only changes the detail painted onto objects. Here's what matters. Textures eat up your card's memory. It's VRAM, not really your FPS. And the jump from high to ultra is tiny. Honestly, almost invisible. So set textures to high and skip ultra. Even I use high. That's the cost of looking good. Now let's meet the settings that hand your FPS right back. DLSS, the FPS hero. The star here is DLSS, which stands for Deep Learning Super Sampling, made by Nvidia. Here's the clever bit. Running a game at 4K means drawing over 8 million pixels every single frame. That's crushing. So instead, your GPU draws the game at a lower resolution, like 1080p, and then AI upscales it up to 4K. Think of an artist sketching small and fast, then a smart assistant blowing it up and filling in the detail. Because your GPU only draws the smaller picture, the load drops hard, and your FPS shoots up. A game crawling at 30 frames can suddenly feel buttery smooth. The downsides are small. Sometimes you get faint glitches, or ghosting, little trails smearing behind moving objects, and DLSS only runs on Nvidia RTX cards. But honestly, it's about as close to free FPS as it gets. Turn it on, set it to quality. DLSS is amazing, but it's Nvidia only. So what about everyone on AMD? FSR, the one for everyone. That's FSR, or Fidelity FX Super Resolution, AMD's answer. Same core idea, render lower, then upscale higher. Its big appeal has always been how open it is. The popular versions run on just about any card, even Nvidia's, while DLSS stays locked to Nvidia only. And Intel has its own version too, called XeSS, so together they complete the trio. The trade-off is that FSR can look a little less sharp and solid than DLSS. But it's a fantastic backup, especially on the days DLSS gets glitchy after a driver update. Upscaling makes each frame lighter to draw. But what if you could invent whole new frames out of nothing? Dynamic resolution, the autopilot. Before we get there, one quiet helper. Dynamic resolution. Say you're cruising at a smooth 60 FPS, and then a huge explosion fills the screen. Normally, your GPU chokes and the frames tank. Dynamic resolution steps in and automatically lowers the resolution for those heavy moments, just enough to hold your FPS steady. Once the chaos clears, it quietly turns the sharpness back up. The picture goes a touch soft for a blink, but you'll rarely catch it. If you hate sudden stutters, turn it on. That still draws real frames though. So, what happens when the game makes up brand new ones? Frame generation, the frame faker. That's frame generation. Normally, your GPU draws every frame one by one. With frame generation on, the system inserts AI-made frames in between the real ones. It's like a flipbook, where a robot draws the in-between pages. Your FPS counter jumps way up, and motion looks silky. But here's the part almost nobody tells you, and it's the big one. More frames on the counter doesn't mean the game feels faster. Watch closely. Without it, you fire and the bullet has already hit the target. With frame generation on, you've clicked. But the bullet is still traveling. The screen is lagging behind your hands. That delay between your click and the game reacting is called input lag. More frames, but more input lag. Good news though, there are latency reducers built to fight exactly this, like Nvidia Reflex and AMD Anti-lag. Flip those on alongside and you claw a lot of that delay back. So frame generation is great for slow, cinematic games where it just looks gorgeous. But turn it off for fast competitive shooters like Valorant or Counter-Strike, where a split second decides the fight. Unless you've got Reflex on too. That's how you win FPS back. The last two settings handle smoothness in a totally different way. Display sync, the tier fixer. Ever seen the screen look like two photos taped together crooked, split right across the middle? That's screen tearing. It happens when your GPU and your monitor run at different speeds. Half of one frame and half of another end up on screen at the same time. Display sync fixes it. The old way is VSync, which forces your GPU to slow down and match the monitor. It kills the tearing, but it adds input lag. The smarter way is G-Sync from Nvidia or FreeSync from AMD. Instead of chaining the GPU, they let the monitor flex its speed to match the GPU. No tearing and barely any lag. The only catch is you need a monitor that supports it. If yours does, use G-Sync or FreeSync over plain VSync every time. That's for playing. But what if you also stream while you game? NVENC, the streamer's helper. Then you'll want to know about NVENC. When you record or stream, something has to squeeze that video down in real time, and normally your CPU does it. Problem is, that's heavy work, so your FPS takes a hit right when you're trying to play. NVENC is a dedicated chip inside Nvidia cards that takes over that job. Your CPU stays free, and your frames barely budge. It's really a streamer's tool. If you don't record or stream, you can happily ignore it. But if you do, it's a lifesaver. All right, that's all 12. So what should you actually turn on or off? Here's the cheat sheet I promised. The cheat sheet. First, the free wins. Always turn these on. Anisotropic filtering at X16. Textures on high. An upscaler, like DLSS, FSR, or XeSS, set to quality. Reflex, or anti-lag, if your card has it. Plus HDR if your screen supports it, and G-Sync or FreeSync if your monitor does. Next, turn these on only if your GPU can afford it. Ray tracing, the beauty tax, and anti-aliasing at a moderate level. Now, turn these off for competitive or fast games. Frame generation, because of the input lag. VSync, since G-Sync or FreeSync does it better. And motion blur while you're at it. Finally, the ones to just skip. Ultra textures, since high looks the same. And path tracing, unless you own a top-tier card. If you only remember one thing, remember this. Setting DLSS or FSR to quality is almost always free performance. And never leave frame generation on in a competitive shooter. So the whole menu really comes down to a simple deal. Beauty settings cost you FPS, and upscaling settings give it back. Balance the two and you get a game that's gorgeous and smooth at once. If this made those scary settings finally click, tap that like button. Hit subscribe for more tech in plain English. And go check out my Every PC Component Explained video next to see the hardware actually running all of this. Okay,